There are stories in Tibet of deaths that leave no body behind. The master dies. The students wrap the body, seal it in a small room, and close the door. 7 days later, they open it. And by their account, the body is almost gone. No ordinary funeral. Nothing to burn, almost nothing to bury. Only hair, fingernails, and the robes of someone who had been sitting there a week before. You can believe that or not. The evidence, and the people who tried to investigate it, belongs to the next episode, because that story deserves a video of its own. But here's the part that should stop you. The students who tell these stories are not frightened by them. They are not even surprised. To them, it is no miracle. It is what the tradition says can happen at the farthest edge of a single teaching. This is Dzogchen, the Great Perfection. A teaching the Nyingma tradition guarded for centuries through transmission, secrecy, and hidden treasure texts, and treated as its most direct path. And Dzogchen does not begin with light or with death. It begins with an idea that sounds almost like an insult. There is nothing for you to achieve, nowhere to go, nothing to become. You are at this very moment already the thing every prayer and every meditation ever invented is straining toward, and the straining itself is the one thing standing in the way. By the end of this video, you will understand how a tradition could believe a human body can dissolve into light. Not whether you should believe it, but how, inside this teaching, such a thing could even be thought. And to get there, we have to begin with why anyone would look you in the eye and call your entire search for enlightenment a mistake. Every school we have explored in this series has a beginning you can point to. Theravada has its councils and its canon. The Mahayana has its great philosophers, its sutras emerging into the light of history. Even the wild tantric world of Vajrayana has Padmasambhava, the man who, as we saw, walked into Tibet and subdued its demons one by one. Dzogchen has none of that. By its own account, it has no beginning at all. And that absence is not an accident of lost records. It is the claim. Let me be careful here because this is where it would be easy to overstate things. Historically, Dzogchen has a clear home. It belongs to the Nyingma, the ancient ones, the oldest of Tibet's 4 great schools. It has texts you can date, teachers you can name, a transmission you can follow down the centuries. Scholars can study its history like the history of anything else. So it did not come from nowhere as a matter of record. It came from nowhere in its own self-understanding. Because the Dzogchen lineage does not trace itself back to a clever human being who worked something out. It traces itself back to Samantabhadra, in Tibetan, Kuntu Zangpo, the primordial Buddha, not a god and not a creator, but awareness itself before anything was ever created. A naked, deep blue figure in the old paintings, sitting in empty space, standing for the pure knowing the tradition says was always already here. From that timeless source, the teaching is said to have passed to the first human holder, a master called Garab Dorje, and from him down a named chain to Manjushri, to Sri Singha, to Vimalamitra, and to Padmasambhava himself, and onward into Tibet. Part history, part revelation, part sacred memory. And there is a detail about Garab Dorje worth holding on to, because we will return to it at the very end. When he died, the tradition says his body dissolved into a mass of rainbow light, and that his entire teaching survived him, condensed into 3 short lines small enough in the legend to fit inside a golden casket the size of a thumbnail. 3 lines. The first in the old translations runs, introducing directly the face of Rigpa itself. Recognize, in other words, what you already are. The second, decide on that and nothing else. The third, rest with confidence in the natural liberation of whatever arises. The whole of Dzogchen, the tradition holds, is contained in those three statements. You can feel how strange all of this is for a modern mind. We want an inventor. We want a date. We want to know who thought of it first. Dzogchen quietly refuses to give us any of that. It insists it describes something no one invented because it was never not the case. The teaching, it says, is as old as awareness, which is to say beginningless. And the people who carried it understood how dangerous it could be in the wrong hands. So they did two things with it. Some of it they passed down openly, teacher to student, in an unbroken oral line, and some of it they hid. Across the Tibetan landscape, masters concealed Dzogchen teachings as terma, treasures. Some were buried in caves, some were sealed inside rock or sunk beneath lakes, and some, the Nyingma hold, were hidden in the most secure vault of all, concealed within the mind stream itself, planted in a student's awareness to surface lifetimes later, when a destined revealer would remember what had been placed there and bring it into the world at the moment it was needed. A teaching deliberately sealed away and set to wait. So what was so precious or so perilous that it had to be buried like that? To feel the answer, you have to set the teaching against everything this series has shown you so far. Imagine you train your whole life for a race, years of it, and on the morning of the race your teacher takes you aside and tells you there was never a finish line, that there was never a race at all, and that every single step you took toward the thing you wanted carried you further from it. That is the disorientation at the center of Dzogchen. And I want to be precise about it, because it is very easy to soften this into something comfortable that it is not. The tradition draws a line between two things. The first is what it calls the ordinary mind, the busy, grasping, commenting surface of you, the voice narrating right now, the part that plans, worries, judges, remembers, wants, the endless weather of thought. The second is Rigpa, pure awareness, the knowing in which all that weather appears. And the central claim of Dzogchen is this, that this awareness was never damaged by anything that has passed through it. No thought ever scratched it, no grief ever stained it. It is not improved across your years of effort, and it did not diminish in your worst hour. For one instant, it has never been anything less than fully awake. Sit with what that means. Every other path we have studied is a path of becoming. The Theravada practitioner moves through the 4 stages toward liberation, fetter by fetter, as we saw. The Bodhisattva works across unimaginable spans of time, perfecting generosity, patience, wisdom. Do this, and you will become that. Dzogchen calls itself something different. It calls itself the resultant vehicle. The practitioner does not travel toward the result. They begin from it. The awakening does not wait at the end of the road. It is the ground underfoot, and has been the whole time while the eyes searched everywhere else for it. The tradition organizes this around 3 words: ground, path, and fruition. The ground is the hardest to speak about, so the texts describe it through 3 qualities at once. Empty in essence, not a thing, not a soul, not a hidden object lodged somewhere inside you. Luminous in nature, aware, knowing, never blank, and responsive in its energy, endlessly giving rise to experience. Closer to the open condition that allows anything to appear at all than to any object that could be found. The path, then, is not a journey toward that ground. It is the slow work of recognizing what is already here, and the fruition is that recognition, grown stable and unbroken. Notice the shape of it. The beginning and the end are the same. The whole path is the distance between not noticing and noticing. Now, a teaching this slippery could easily have dissolved into vague mysticism, a few beautiful phrases, nothing you could hold. That it did not is largely the work of one man. In the 14th century, a master named Longchenpa gathered the scattered Dzogchen teachings and gave them a structure that has held for 700 years. And he did not write from a comfortable seat of authority. He had held high monastic positions and walked away from them, withdrawing into the mountains, a hermit, a poet, a philosopher, trying to give language to a teaching whose whole point was that language was the problem. Much of his greatest work was composed in retreat at a place called Gangri Tokar, the White Skull Snow Mountain, where he eventually died. His name means something close to the vast expanse of space. Where others had left luminous fragments, Longchenpa built the architecture, and much of what any teacher says about Dzogchen today still runs through him. His writings circle one paradox again and again. The ground is already perfectly pure, and yet beings wander endlessly, for no other reason than that they fail to recognize it. The whole tragedy in his telling is a case of mistaken identity, looking everywhere for what is doing the looking. This is where the teaching stops being abstract, even for someone who never sets foot in a retreat hut. Most of us, when we think of spiritual progress, think of reaching better states, a calmer mind, a more peaceful day, and those states are real, but they arrive and then they pass, the way all moods pass. Dzogchen points somewhere else entirely. It points at the awareness that is equally present in the calm and in the storm, the knowing that does not improve when you feel good and does not diminish when you feel terrible. The argument is that chasing better states keeps you on the surface, rearranging the weather, while the sky you are actually looking for has been holding all of it the whole time. And I want to stop here and name something directly, because this is where Dzogchen gets badly misunderstood. You are already perfect. There is nothing to achieve. You have heard versions of that on 1,000 calming videos. It has become a kind of spiritual wallpaper, soothing, flattering, easy. That is not what this is. This is not the warm reassurance that you are fine as you are. It is a far more disorienting claim that the self who would like to be reassured is part of the very weather we are talking about, and that the thing Dzogchen points to is not a better version of you at all. It is closer to the bottom dropping out. People who encounter it directly more often describe vertigo than comfort. Keep that difference in mind, because the tradition guarded these teachings precisely so they would not be flattened into something pleasant. This is also why the tradition warns that the teaching is dangerous when it is heard too early. The ego hears nothing to achieve and relaxes into laziness. Despair hears it and decides that effort was always pointless. Pride hears it and quietly crowns itself enlightened. The tradition means none of those things. It is pointing at something underneath the one who would be lazy or hopeless or proud. And that is exactly the recognition no slogan can hand you. And Tibet, as it turns out, was not the only place to arrive at this particular edge. On the far side of the Himalayas, in China, and later in Japan, another tradition had been circling the same insight for centuries. We have explored it on this channel before: Zen. Zen, too, says the awakened nature is already present. Zen, too, distrusts the long ladder of gradual effort and the scaffolding of concepts. At their sharpest edge, the two traditions can sound uncannily close, both pointing at an awareness that was never absent, never earned. But they could not look more different. And the difference is worth one clean sentence. Zen removes. It strips the room bare, empty walls, a single line of ink, silence, the bare cushion. It clears everything away until only awareness is left. Dzogchen does the opposite. It opens into light, visions, luminosity, an entire technicolor cosmos of appearance arising within that same awareness. A similar abyss, opposite faces, one empties the room, the other fills it with light. And here is a detail historians find tantalizing. These two traditions may have actually met. In the 8th century, as Buddhism took root in Tibet, Chinese Chan masters and Indian Buddhist teachers were present in the same country at the same time. Tibetan tradition records a great debate at Samye, the first monastery, between an Indian master named Kamalashila and a Chinese Chan teacher remembered as Mo Hu Yen. The question between them was exactly this one: sudden awakening or gradual, whole cloth recognition or the step-by-step path. Whether the debate unfolded precisely as the later Tibetan histories describe is another question. The records are not simple, and historians treat the tidy version with caution. But the memory of it matters because Tibet remembered itself standing at a fork between sudden recognition and gradual cultivation, and chose two streams that may have brushed against each other once on Tibetan soil and then flowed apart, one austere, one luminous. The same flattening happened when both traditions reached the West. The radical claim got smoothed into a slogan: be present. You are enough. Let go. The most demanding teachings either tradition produced became background music for a culture that wanted to relax, and most people who repeat the slogans have no idea what they were carved out of. So we understand the claim now, but understanding a teaching is a different thing from practicing it. And when we turn to how Dzogchen is actually practiced, we reach the part the tradition spent centuries refusing to separate from direct transmission. There are two core practices in Dzogchen. One of them is a kind of radical simplicity, the bare minimum a mind can do. The other works with light and darkness until, the tradition claims, the line between your awareness and the world in front of you begins to give way. And everything in this final stretch hangs on one question: how does any of this end in a body that dissolves into light? The first practice is called trekchö. The word means something close to cutting through rigidity, cutting through the solidity of thought. We move through our lives treating our thoughts as massively, urgently solid. This worry, that story about ourselves, this identity we are defending. In the language of the tradition, trekchö is not about improving those thoughts or stilling them. It is about seeing straight through their apparent solidity before the mind can build a self out of them to the open awareness underneath, where each thought releases itself the way a line drawn on water releases itself the instant it is drawn. It sounds like the easiest thing in the world. It is closer to the hardest. And for our question, it does one essential thing. It establishes, directly in experience, that awareness was never actually trapped by any of it. The cage was always open. The second practice is where Dzogchen becomes something few traditions on earth can match. It is called tögal, direct crossing, or the leap over. I'm going to describe what it points toward, and I am deliberately not going to give you instructions, because the tradition itself does not. Tögal is undertaken only after long stability in trekchö, only under a qualified master, and historically it was never taught openly at all. There's a reason for that, and we will come to it. Tögal works with light. Traditional descriptions mention dark retreat, the open sky, and appearances of luminosity, points and spheres and linked chains of light. But those details belong to a transmission context, under a master, and not to casual experiment. The heart of the practice is the recognition that these appearances are not arriving from somewhere outside. They arise from awareness itself, The light seen and the awareness seeing it are revealed as one thing. Through tögal, the tradition describes a progression of visions that grow and intensify and finally exhaust themselves, culminating in what the texts call the exhaustion of phenomena into reality. The last veil between awareness and appearance wears completely through. There is no longer a watcher here and a world out there, only luminous awareness, with nothing left over. Now, the secrecy. Because this is the moment to address it honestly. These teachings were hidden and restricted, and it would be easy to read that as mystery for its own sake, or as a way of keeping power in the hands of a few. The tradition's own explanation is simpler and more sober. It holds that these practices can destabilize a person who is not prepared, that to work directly with the raw material of awareness and perception, without the ground of trekchö and the guidance of someone who has crossed the territory, is to risk real harm. The secrecy was protection. You can see now what was being protected and from what. And this brings us to the edge of the whole teaching. Follow the logic all the way down. If awareness and appearance were never two separate things, if even the solid-seeming world arises as nothing other than the clarity of mind, then the body is not exempt from that. The body, too, is appearance. The body, too, arises within awareness. So what happens to a body when the person inhabiting it has finally recognized that nothing was ever separate from awareness at all? That is the question we started with: a sealed room, a closed door, and a body that would not stay a body. It has a name: the rainbow body. In Tibetan, Jalu. The claim is this: when a master has completed the path, when, in the highest accounts, ordinary clinging has reached complete exhaustion, and not a fiber of their being still holds the world as separate and solid, then at the moment of death, the physical body is no longer anchored the way ours is. Over the days that follow, the elements that make up the body are said to dissolve back into their essential nature, understood as light. The flesh recedes, the body grows smaller, and what remains in the accounts is only hair and nails, the parts considered impure, the parts left behind. Notice why inside this teaching that is no arbitrary miracle tacked onto the end. It is the doctrinal endpoint of the entire view, the place all of it was always pointing. And if you have followed this channel, you have already seen it. When we told the story of Yeshe Tsogyal, the queen who became Tibet's first female Buddha, her life ended this way. Her body, the accounts say, dissolved into rainbow light, exactly as we have described it here. At the time, we named that as the highest sign of Dzogchen realization. This is the teaching behind that sign. The whole path was the recognition that appearance was never separate from awareness. The rainbow body is that recognition followed all the way into the body itself. The point was never to gain some extraordinary power. The point was to stop obscuring what was always true, until even the body has nothing left to hold it in ordinary form, and returns to what the texts say it always was. It is also rare almost beyond counting. Most practitioners, even great ones, never show such a sign. It stands as the most extreme mark of the highest realization, not as a normal result. If this sounds familiar, it should. We began the lineage with it. Garab Dorje, the first human master, whose own body is said to have dissolved into rainbow light. The accounts say his closest student, Manjushar Mitra, cried out after him, "Alas, if the light that is our teacher is gone, who will dispel the darkness of the world?" And from that light, the story goes, a small golden casket descended into his hands holding the three statements. The tradition begins and ends in the same place, in a body becoming light. This teaching very nearly disappeared. After the 1959 Tibetan uprising and the Dalai Lama's flight into exile, the rupture we explored in our video on the Dalai Lama, these lineages came within a breath of being lost altogether. And in one of history's strange reversals, the catastrophe that almost ended Dzogchen is exactly what carried it to the rest of the world. Masters who would have lived and died on the Tibetan plateau instead crossed into India, into Europe, into America. Some of that transmission was extraordinary. Namkhai Norbu, trained in Tibet before the exile, later a professor in Italy, spent decades building Dzogchen into a living international community, rather than a museum piece. And some of it carried a warning. Figures like Chogyam Trungpa, brilliant and magnetic, showed the danger on the other side, that Western students, hungry and unprepared, could mistake charisma and the language of crazy wisdom for realization itself. The teaching survived its journey west. It did not always arrive cleanly. Which leaves us holding two things at once and refusing to collapse them into one. Here is what the tradition claims and the inner logic by which it claims it. A teaching that begins with nothing to achieve, ends with one of the most extraordinary physical claims in Buddhism, that in the rarest cases the awakened body returns to light. But logic is not evidence, devotion is not documentation. Whether a human body has ever truly done this, whether there is anything to these accounts beyond faith and the deep love of students for their teachers, is a different question entirely, and it is not one Tibet can settle for us. People have gone looking, though, carefully. One of them was a Catholic priest who heard these accounts and decided to investigate them as seriously as anyone ever has. That story, the cases, the investigation, what holds up and what does not, is where the next episode begins. For now, sit with the teaching on its own terms, because even setting every miraculous claim aside, what remains is one of the most uncompromising ideas in Buddhism. Dzogchen says you are not climbing toward the light, you are the light. Briefly convinced, you are the lamp. And for a rare few, the tradition claims, the moment that mistake finally ends, even the lamp has nothing left to hold. If you want teachings like this one taken seriously without being swallowed whole, explored with care, neither sold nor dismissed, stay with this channel. The investigation into the rainbow body itself and the priest who crossed the world to examine it is coming next. Until then.